10 men stand in a line. They have marched together, fought together, survived together. Now they must choose. A leather pouch is passed down the ranks. Inside are 10 stones. 9 are pale, 1 is black. Each man reaches in, feels the weight, draws his fate. The one who holds the black stone will not face the enemy. He will face his friends. In the Roman army, this was not murder, it was discipline. It was called decimation, and if your unit failed, Rome made you choose who would die. Decimation. Today we use that word loosely. A stock price was decimated. A football team's defence was decimated. We use it to mean wiped out. But that isn't what it meant. The word comes from the Latin decimatio, from decimus, meaning 10th. Decimation did not mean annihilation. It meant something much worse. It meant 1 in every 10. Not chaos, not the heat of battle, but a cold, mathematical lottery. When a Roman unit disgraced itself through cowardice, mutiny, or failure, the men were assembled. They were divided into groups of 10. The pouch was passed. Stones were drawn. 1 man from each group was selected by luck, and the remaining 9 were ordered to carry out the sentence. They didn't use a headsman. They used their own hands, their own clubs, their own stones. The men they had marched with, the men they had slept beside, the men they had sworn to protect, were the men who became their executioners. That was decimation. It didn't just break a unit, it broke the men who survived. Decimation was a cruel and merciless punishment. But it was not used for barbarism alone, it was a method of control. It was what Rome did when fear began to spread, when its iron grip on its armies began to waver, when formations hesitated, when orders were ignored, when men ran, when the slightest show of cowardice betrayed the valour of Rome. The Roman army survived on discipline. Every shield locked, every command obeyed, every man holding his place. But fear is contagious. If one unit breaks, another will follow. An army does not collapse all at once, it unravels. So Rome answered fear with something far more terrifying: certainty. When a cohort failed, it was divided into groups of 10. A pouch was passed down the line. Each man reached inside and chose a stone. 9 were pale, 1 was black. The man who drew the black stone would pay for the perceived failure of the others, whether he was guilty or not. He was not executed cleanly. He was not spared humiliation. He was beaten to death by the other 9 men, with clubs, with stones, with their own hands. The rest of the cohort stood in formation while it happened, forced to watch, and when it was done, they returned to the ranks. That was the fear, not just death, but being chosen, not by an enemy, but by chance, and being killed by the men beside whom you had marched and bled for Rome. In 71 BCE, Rome faced its most embarrassing crisis, the Third Servile War. An army of slaves, led by the gladiator Spartacus, had consistently humiliated the supposedly invincible Roman legions. Men had fled, seasoned officers had hesitated, the invincible Roman machine was breaking. The Senate demanded a response that would quell the spreading insubordination. They sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose wealth and ambition were matched only by his ruthlessness. He was determined to restore order, whatever the cost. But the army he inherited was shaken. Discipline had failed. So Crassus reached back into Rome's archaic past. Decimation was a relic of the early Republic, a ritual of uncompromising severity that had become rare, almost legendary. Many soldiers knew the word, few expected to ever see it carried out. Crassus revived it. A cohort that had shown cowardice was assembled and divided into groups of 10. They drew stones. 1 man in every 10 was selected to be executed by the remaining 9, beaten to death by his own comrades. It was not symbolic. It was not an idle threat. It was carried out immediately. After the blood dried, the army never ran again. Decimation had worked exactly as intended, a tool of indifferent chance that made the soldiers fear their general far more than the enemy. But decimation did more than restore discipline. It rewired the Roman soul. The 9 survivors were not innocent witnesses, they were participants. They had held the clubs, they had felt the resistance of bone, they had watched a man they once marched beside collapse under their own hands. When they returned to formation, the world had changed. Fear no longer came only from the enemy, it came from within the ranks. The line between loyalty and survival blurred. You didn't just obey your general, you feared him. You didn't just trust the man beside you, you remember he could raise his hand against you when commanded. Decimation did not simply remove 1 in 10, it bound the remaining 9 together in a knot of shared guilt. Collective punishment creates collective responsibility, but it also creates a hollow silence. No one wanted to be the reason the pouch was passed again. Discipline returned, not through inspiration or duty, but through the cold, indifferent math of terror. But decimation was never common. Even in Rome, a civilization comfortable with public execution and battlefield slaughter, this ritual stood apart. It was a weapon of last resort, reserved for total collapse, for mutiny, and for shame that could not be ignored. It appears in the earliest records of the Republic, used sparingly, then fading as the army became a professional machine. By the time of Crassus, it was already archaic, an old ghost feared more in theory than in practice. Under the later emperors, it became rarer still. Roman discipline remained brutal, but it was usually targeted. Individuals were executed, leaders were removed. Decimation was different. It ignored individual guilt. It reduced human failure to cold mathematics. 1 in 10. When it was used, it wasn't because Rome lacked other tools. It was because a commander wanted to make a statement, a message that would echo down the ranks long after the blood had dried. Decimation did not simply remove 1 in 10, it bound the remaining 9 together in a knot of shared guilt. Collective punishment creates collective responsibility, but it also creates a hollow silence. No one wanted to be the reason the pouch was passed again. Discipline returned, not through inspiration or duty, but through the cold, indifferent math of terror. Decimation was never really about punishment. It was about absolute control over the men Rome relied on for its glory. It meant watching a man die beside you, not because he was the coward among you, but because the lot fell his way. And then, it meant returning to formation. Rome conquered the known world. Its legions marched across continents, built roads, and raised cities that still stand today. But they did so under a system where discipline could demand blood from the innocent. Sometimes the enemy stood across the battlefield, and sometimes he stood in the line beside you. That was decimation.